Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillah. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Welcome back, everyone, to another lecture discussion in our class on modern financial transactions. So, a common transaction, and this will be very common to everybody, is renting something with the option to buy. Sometimes we refer to it as leasing with the option to buy. And one of the challenges is the names, right? These names, they have different names. Why do they have different names? Well, they have different names because in the secular legal context, each name will have certain conditions that you'll find in the contract. We're not going to get, obviously, it's not a class on commercial law, but it's a class on Islamic financial law, the new transactions and how Islamic law seeks to understand them. The upshot, just in case anyone's wondering, is Islamic banks have this kind of transaction. But the issue is, there's a couple of issues. One issue, if you haven't picked up on it already, is the fact that these are two transactions in one. That you're renting something and then there's the option to buy, or you're renting something to buy it at the end. The option part, that's from me. That's actually not the name of the lecture or the transaction. What is it called in Arabic? One second, I'm sorry. Al-ijaratu al-muntahiyya bit-tamlik. Yeah, so it's renting something that ends in ownership. The option to buy, I say, is because, subhanAllah, that's what I'm used to hearing in the English language. But in the Arabic or in the Islamic banking context, it's I'm going to rent something that will lead to ownership. That's what I wanted to say. So we know from the previous few lectures that that's two in one, right? There's the renting part and then there's the owning part. So right away, that comes to our mind, the mind of the fiqh. Okay, well, there's a difference of opinion in the classical fiqh, the inherited fiqh, al-fiqh al-mawruth, on the permissibility of joining two contracts. We're going to take the position that it's allowed beyond any certain madhab, because it's not in our madhab, that okay, you can do two in one, but what are the details of both of those transactions? So what we're going to do in the lecture is look a little bit about the modern concept of it from a secular point of view, and then we'll come and put it together in an Islamic legal garb, and then see how the fuqaha opine on that in the modern context to allow it to happen. So, sorry if I mumbled a little bit, but you get what I'm trying to say. These are the main points of today's lecture, inshallah. All right, so the big problem that we're trying to solve, or the big problem that these transactions are trying to solve, rather, is that we cannot just simply buy big ticket items. And that's a function, and I'll repeat it, it's worth repeating, it's a function of not really having gold and silver as a standard of currency. So there's an unbelievable amount of inflation, whereas with gold, I mean, I'm not an economist or a currency expert, but the little that I know is that, if you have gold and silver directly or backed currency, there's only so much gold and silver you can have. So logic would dictate that there's only going to be a certain amount of money. That also limits the kind of development that the world has undergone in the last 100 years. We would not have been able to do that if we just had gold and silver. I'm not saying it's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm just a fact of life. Because we have paper money, there's this huge, you can literally, things can cost billions of dollars. I mean, 150, 200 years ago, maybe one superpower in the world would barely break $1 billion of its GDP or something like that. Now it's, there are people that have that kind of money. So we have to acknowledge that that's just a reality that we live in. Remember, one of the things that my professor, Sayyid Hussein Nasr, Allah Ta'ala preserve him, who was my real first kind of introductory to formal Islamic studies in the university, he used to always say this line that I just think beautifully captures everything that Islam, when it comes to Islamic law, Islam begins with the reality of the human condition. Right? So our job is not to paint a utopic, idealistic position. If we were in power in government, then we would probably want to paint or chart a new way. That's how Allah has given us. Allah has given us the task here together to learn Islamic law. So we are looking at the reality of the human condition. Anybody's ijtihad, as I've mentioned before, Imam al-Ghazali says, it's only going to be as strong as how creative their mind is, how they can conceptualize the issues of today, and most importantly, how they could potentially conceptualize issues in the future, what we call al-ma'alat, what will happen in the future. That's part of ijtihad. So it's not enough just to know the knickknacks of the fiqh and the tools of usul al-fiqh. I mean, those are important tools, but you got to be creative. You got to be a smart person. And to be creative, in this endeavor, you have as much effort as we are going to learn the fiqh and the tools of the sharia, the same level of effort we have to know the matter at hand, the dunyawi aspect, the secular aspect. Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi, rahimahullah, in Al-Faqih al-Mutafaqih, which is a very important book because it's essentially a commentary on Imam al-Shafi'i's Al-Risala. And what he does is he basically shows how every single sentence in the Risala is directly connected to the Quran and Sunnah. And that's why it's a really, really highly recommend you read that book. And I really hope that somebody would translate it, because it's just unbelievable how, I mean, it just makes you love Imam Shafi'i. I'm sorry to go on a little tangent, but we all love Imam Shafi'i radiallahu anhu. I mean, it's just unbelievable that Allah Ta'ala inspired him. You think it's a very technical book of jurisprudence, but in essence, he's just restating all of the Quran and Sunnah to create these tools of interpretation. Why am I saying that? Oh, yeah. Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi radiallahu anhu, he says in the book that the faqih has to know the matters of the dunya just as he has to know the matters of the sharia. Other scholars will say, I think the generation before my teachers, they would say, or maybe 2 generations prior, they would say the faqih cannot be a faqih unless he knows history, and the historian cannot be a historian unless they know fiqh. The Islamic Sunni curriculum, the manhaj that we are teaching, which I refer to either as Usuli Islam or the manhaj of Al-Azhar, because that's where I was trained, which encapsulates that. And I don't mean by Al-Azhar the brick and mortar, but the methodology, is that you have to be trained in both as well. So I know I'm kind of rambling on, but I'll get to my point very quickly, which is to say that you got to know the dunya stuff as well. It's not enough just to know what the Islamic law books say. A lot of muftis, let's be fair, in the quote-unquote modern world, which is either like right now or like 40, 50, 60 years ago, a lot of times they failed in this aspect, or they were deficient, let's say, not failed, they were deficient in this aspect, that's why we have all of these differences of modern legal opinion about some of these transactions. So it's not enough just to know the details of all of the madhahib. That in itself is a tall order, because usually you're just trained in one madhab, but now you got to know all of the madhahib. That's a huge order. In addition, let me just tack on more to you. You got to learn the dunya stuff. So that's sort of how these classes have been functioning, which is basically the first lecture. I kind of give you a background. Anyway, so the problem we're solving, or rather the problem that this transaction is solving, is how do you buy big ticket items? Well, we said that you can't really buy them because of what I mentioned about the inflation aspect of fiat currency. So now we are in need of an institution. It can't be a person, because only one person, like a parent or a grandparent or a rich uncle or aunt, they can help out once in a blue moon, but they can't be an institution. So we need to institutionalize this to help finance people's stuff, industry, commerce, property, livestock, appliances, furniture, cars, homes, etc., education, etc. So that's where the bank comes in, right? The bank emerged, as we said, in Europe several hundred years ago to be able to, obviously when I say bank emerged, the bank of today is not like what the bank was before, but this is the generic bank, opened up as an institution licensed by the state, given its capital, has its laws and its governance, etc., to be able to do this kind of stuff. So we talked about loans, we talked about finance. This is another one of those models, which is probably more common for an individual consumer, which I'm going to rent something, and then that rent is going to lead me to buying it. It's just another way of how can I bring ownership. Why is all of this important, other than the dunyawi aspects that I mentioned? Well, it's important because ownership, property, is one of the maqasid of the Sharia. So it's something that we believe is it's a sacred right. If I own this, if it's mine, then that's a sacred thing. You can't come and take it. If you take it, then there are damages that are involved. There's theft. It's a moral sin. I can take recourse to the courts. I can have my rights reinstated. You could be punished. God forbid, things like that. So, the right of property, the right of ownership is something that's important. No one can come and take that which you own outright legally that you bought. So for us, this is really important stuff, because we want people to own things. That's an important part, that Allah Ta'ala has created the world for us so that we can own things, use them, pass them on, develop the world. وَهُوَ أَنْشَأَكُم مِّنَ الْأَرْضِ وَاسْتَعْمَرَكُم فِيهَا. Allah Ta'ala caused you to become and to be from the matter of the earth and has asked of you. وَاسْتَعْمَرَكُم, it's istaf'ala, the form of the verb, meaning that Allah has asked of us that we develop it. Okay, way too long of a tangent. I apologize. Let's come back to earth. So basically what this transaction is saying, and this is also another European type of thing. I think in the notes he says that this happened in England in the mid-19th century with issues of purchasing musical instruments. I didn't have a chance to verify that, so that's not really neither here nor there, but it is something that came from a European experience, which is that I'm going to rent to you this house for 10 years, and you're going to pay me monthly or quarterly or yearly installments. I mean, usually now it's going to be monthly, but I have seen in the modern world examples where things would be paid in a quarterly installment, which is a very difficult thing for a consumer, but I've seen that happen before. You're going to pay me in these equal installments, and at the end of it, I am going to give you the deed to it. I'm going to give you the ownership of it. So one of the problems there is, from one fiqh point of view, is that a rent is a rent and a buy is a buy. So how can you rent something and then make the ownership of the thing obligatory? So there's a difference of opinion right off the bat from the fiqh thing. When it comes to the Islamic banking, the modern Islamic banking system, oftentimes they'll say, we'll rent it to you and then we'll gift it to you, or we'll rent it to you and then you can purchase it from us for like $1. So the name matters. I know you might sound like, oh, you're splitting hairs. Well, no, because we're trying to comply with the fiqh. I mean, that is important. Even though the picture might look like the same from a macro level, you're renting it and then you're going to own it. Yes, but we're also trying to be faithful to our faith tradition, and also faithful, al-khuruj min al-khilaf mustahab, to go away from matters in which there's a difference of opinion is something that is preferred and liked. So in your individual practice, when you find that there's a difference of opinion, the higher moral, this is a little bit of tasawwuf for you, but the higher moral and ethical path is just to leave that which is there's a difference of opinion. You certainly can do one or more of the valid thing, but the better option is to do that. So because this has to do with finances and money and exchange and ownership, and because we love and respect the four Sunni madhahib, we do try our best to go away from it. So, I'm getting ahead of myself. But basically the idea, as I said, is you're going to rent it, pay the installments, and after the agreed upon period of time, that item will come into your ownership, and we'll pick up this discussion in the next clip, inshallah. Okay. As I said, this came from Europe in the mid-19th century. And when you think about it, the fact that it came from Europe in the mid-19th century, 1830s, 40s, and 50s, that was around the same time. I think the first bank in the Islamic, maybe it was in Egypt. I think it was like 1880s. So you have to understand that all of these things came one lump, lock, stock, and barrel to the Muslim world all at once. It didn't develop the way it developed in Europe. I mean, banking and modern currency and stuff goes back to the 1600s, I think to the Dutch, or late 1500s. I mean, you're talking basically about right after the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation. That's a long time for Europe to kind of figure out what it's going to do. For us, it came literally in a decade. In one decade, the large mass of the Muslim body politic, I'm sure there were places like in Istanbul and the Ottoman Empire, I'm sure state to state, maybe they dealt with things like that, because we know that the Ottoman khulafa and stuff and Salatin, they dealt with European financial houses to fund wars and things like that. But that's like on a state level. You can't assume that the average Muslim, Ottoman, understood what that meant. So just it is, we have to have a little bit of rahmah for our ulama, that was a lot to deal with all at once. Banks, paper money, kind of backed by gold and silver, partially or fully. And to add to all of that, a whole host of these new types of transactions. Okay, the key for this transaction, if we just forget about the Islamic Sharia part, just let's look at the transaction as a transaction. As we said in the previous lecture, or the previous two, is that it's not going to work unless the owning of the item, let's just keep a house as an example, the owning of the house at the end is obligatory and mandated by law. So if I rent for 10 years and I'm thinking that after the 10 years I'm going to get the house, and then the bank stiffs me on the house, and then I have no recourse, then I've just lost all of that money, and I've lost that possibility of owning the house. So you have to understand that for these transactions to work in any setting, and I said this I think in yesterday's class or the class before, in any setting, the transaction has to be enforceable. There has to be law behind it, and there has to be the state behind it to enforce the transaction. And that's where a lot of the fuqaha, that little point, will say, well, how can you rent something in an aqd, in a transaction of renting, and then make it obligatory to own? That's where there's a difference of opinion, and why sometimes they will bifurcate it. But we talked in the previous lecture about the bifurcation, and saying, well, we'll take the opinion that allows us putting two or more transactions together to create one whole transaction, as long as each of the micro transactions we are fulfilling the conditions behind them. Another aspect, obviously it goes without saying, of this transaction is that the installments are known, and that you don't get to own it unless and until you pay all of the installments. And usually in the modern world, you get a letter from the financial institution certifying that you have completed the transaction. And in the case that we're talking about, if the financial institution owns the deed, literally has the deed, they will mail you that deed with the letter saying, congratulations, you fulfilled all of your things, your payments, here is the deed. And then probably you would need to go one step further and make sure that you go to the local municipality and register the property, if we're talking about a house as an example, that it's in your ownership. So sometimes that part people forget about. This is just like a little aside based on my experience. Just because someone mails you something in the mail, it doesn't mean that you have 360 degrees covered of ownership. Sometimes you actually have to go another step that you have to do, and I don't know why people don't tell you this, but sometimes you got to just figure it out, that you have to go register the property, because the bank is registered as the owner of the house. Between you and the bank, they gave you the deed, so the bank thinks I'm done, but it's still registered with the authorities. The authorities and the government, by the way, any government, is always super slow. And bureaucracy is just very slow. It's just, unfortunately, one of the natures of government. I mean, I think from the beginning of time, it's not going to be as fast as you, because they're not just dealing with you, they're dealing with 10,000s of you. So, okay, we'll get to it when we get to it, we'll process it when we process it. But usually there's going to be some kind of way to register. Now, the registering thing, there might be a nominal fee, of registering paperwork or whatnot. That's not a big deal. But there's not going to be any opposition. Why? Because you have that piece of paper is now in your possession. So you do own it. It's like somebody giving you the keys. You own it, but you got to also register that you own it, so that in the future, if there's any, you want to sell it in the future, or inheritance, or whatever the case may be, there's no issue. I know I'm adding something that might seem superfluous, but it's important because it's important for the reason that I just stated, but that also proves that you own it, because there's no opposition. So I can't take your house and then go register in my name, because I have no paperwork. The municipality won't allow me to do that. As a matter of fact, I might be fined, or I might even go to jail because it's a type of theft. But if I have the deed from the financial institution and the letter that says I own it, the deed is in my name, I'm going to take that deed that has my name on it, take you a verifying ID, like a national ID card, passport, birth certificate, whatever the case may be, driver's license, go to the municipality and register it. So now it's mine. I have all of the stuff, but I have to do that one extra step to have that ownership. And the fact that there's no blockage of that from the bank means it's proof that you own the property. So you own it, but sometimes you just got to register it. That's just a little extra thing. Now, in the case of the financial institution not doing that, that's where the law and the enforceability of the contract comes into place. So there'll obviously be boilerplate documents. You're signing like 20, 30 pages and initialing them in the initial agreement, the long pieces of paper with small fine print that no one reads. Somewhere in there, it's going to say what happens. And then that's the document that when you go to court, that's what the judge will use to enforce the sale, right? So for this to work in a secular setting, for this to work in an Islamic banking setting, the transfer of the deed, the transfer of the ownership has to be enforceable at the end. Okay, so from the Islamic point of view, we talked about in the previous lecture that this is essentially two transactions in one. There's the rent, and then there's the owning of it. The owning either can be stipulated if you follow that opinion in fiqh, that's okay. Or the owning can be a gifted, and you can gift with a condition, because the Prophet ﷺ, we Muslims abide by their conditions, and Muslim on the shurutihim. Or it could be purchased in a second microtransaction for like just a symbolic $1. So maybe let's say your payment is $500 a month. They'll say, but the last payment is $499. So you pay $499 and then you send another dollar, which is the purchase price. So depending on which fiqh position, I mean that's like a minor detail that I don't think we need to bother ourselves with. But the bottom line is that there are two separate transactions. If it's a gift, then like we said at the end, they're going to send you the deed in the mail, and that's it's gifted. The owner, the bank, throughout the time that you own it, they can't rent it out to somebody else. Right? You can't double sell it or double rent it or double dip. In the part of the transaction in which you're paying in installments, as we said before, the installments have to be known and they have to be equal amounts and agreed to. Usually, sometimes I've seen this, and now that things are moving digital, I see less of it. But I remember growing up, you'd actually get a coupon book. A coupon book. My children make fun of me of how I pronounce coupon. I say coupon, they say coupon. What I don't know why, but anyway, it's neither here nor there. They'll send you a little booklet that you tear off a stub, and it'll say, 1 of 36 1 of 36. You write the check and you put the stub and you return it. 2 of 36 until you get to the end of the book. Now, because of the paper issue and the paperless situation, if you go online to your online payment portal, you'll find that there, but sometimes it's a little bit elusive. I liked when you just actually had the physical book, because you see the pages going down and the stubs, and the point is that the installments have to be known, the number of installments have to be known, the amount of each installment has to be known, and it can't fluctuate up and down. Unless you're going to refinance, which is you to enter into another transaction with another, I'm not going to talk about that, but that is permissible, because you're basically entering into a new contract. You're settling the old contract with another service provider or the same service provider. They're going to pay out this, and then you're going to enter into a new contract. But the point of view is that the payment, the number of payments and the installment of payment have to be known. And then there has to be the promise and the condition that after you finish the payment, this property is going to come into your possession one way or another. And we'll wrap this up in the next clip, inshallah. Okay, there's actually not that much more to say. Some of these notes are a little bit thin, to be honest, between the two of us, but we have to fill up this lecture time. So let's look at another layer of transaction. You have to forgive me because the notes are in Arabic and I got to read it, comprehend it, and then say it in another language. Sometimes there's a little bit of a lag time. It's not that the connection is bad. إلى عدم جواز اشتراط. So the consensus of the fiqh community saying that was an opposing position is that you can't make a condition. It's not consensus, but the majority position. You can't make a condition that you are not going to transfer ownership until all of the payments are made. Because this goes against the basic philosophy of al-bay'a, which is to ijab and qabul, and to buy. Okay, well obviously that's going to be a problem for us, because then that would just render the whole thing null and void. Some of the Malikis and the Hanbalis and other fuqaha say that it's permissible to do that. Thank God. So that's obviously the position that we're following here, or the fiqh councils are following. And they argue is that, well, the philosophy of bay'a is that it's based on its conditions. As a matter of fact, all of Islamic law is based on conditions. As a matter of fact, that which is between us and the crazies and the extremists is the fact that we understand that all of fiqh is based on conditions. Everything is based on prayers, on conditions. Wudu is on conditions, so on and so forth. When the conditions are fulfilled, then the act is fulfilled. If they're not, then the act is not fulfilled, etc. And they base this on the hadith of the Prophet al-Muslimun ala shurutihim. Muslims abide, the definition of Muslim is they abide by their conditions. So, like I said in the previous, I think maybe the last 2 or 3, maybe even 4 lectures, in the modern in this class, and when we analyze modern transactions, number 1, we're going to go beyond our madhab, and number 2, we're not always going to follow what the majority of the scholars say. As long as there's a legitimate opinion attached to one or more of the 4 madhabs, even if it's a minor opinion in those madhabs, then we're going to follow it. Why? Because we have a situation where how else on earth are you going to own a home or a car and things like that? Okay, and the fiqh, I think there's a fiqh meeting in Kuwait in 1988 in which they verified the permissibility of this kind of transaction. That they'll be renting in known installments. The ownership would take place when the time is done of the installments and when the contract of renting has finished, because when you're paying the installments because you're renting, in our example, the house, you're renting it, so there's going to be a time. I forgot to mention that earlier. So there's a time to the contract. So there's payments and time of the contract. And then there's the ownership is given to you afterwards. Well, therein ends the printed notes. So it's kind of thin here, but so let me kind of riff on my own a little bit on this. We can notice, for example, that this transaction is very different than the transaction that we talked about yesterday, where something is, there's a murabaha, there's a profit with the promise of buying or selling at the end, in which the bank buys you the house, and then you buy the house from the bank in installments. Because that transaction is a straight up bay'ah sale that's based on murabaha, based on profit. This, it's based on rent. So if you don't make all of your rent payments, or you decide that you don't want to, then you can get out of it because you've only been renting it from the person. So maybe in the contract it's stipulated that we'll rent for 5 years, and at the end of each year you can review the rent agreement or you can cancel it. But when you agree to buy the property from the bank, that's a little bit different because you're not renting it, you're in the process of buying it, but you're just paying in installments, which we said is permissible. So how do you know the difference when it comes to these things? A lot of times the answer to that is what happens if you break the contract and you have to go to court. How will the judge look? Players act like you're the judge to adjudicate the case. Of course, bad things happen all the time. So even in yesterday's transaction, if you're buying something from the bank because they bought it and you're paying them in installments, and something happens and you can't pay it, of course, there'll be some kind of severance clause. But at that time, the bank still owns the house, not you. So the bank gets the short end of the stick, but things happen. So there'll be clauses in the contract that talk about the termination of the contract. So that's one difference that you can kind of pick up here, is the difference of what happens when you break the contract. So some of these contracts, they will look similar in the flow of money, but they're titled different. So this is rent, the other one was purchase, murabaha, with the promise of purchasing. As said in the conventional banks, it's temwil, it's a type of finance. And therein lies, as we say in English, the devil's in the detail. Therein lies all of the differences of the fiqh positions. Some people are more conservative, muftis, modern muftis are more conservative of having to abide by single transactions or having to abide by the names. I think that al-qard, I don't see this as tamwil, as finance, I see it as a loan from the bank, which is incorrect, but some people say that. So I don't want to deal with that at all. So we're going to create this other mechanism. It does the same thing, but it's called something different. Obviously, one person's initial reaction will be, well, what's the point if it's the same thing? Well, the point is that they're titled different things, and therefore, when they're titled different things, underneath those different things are different conditions. So rent in Islam has different conditions and protections for the owner and for like damages and liability. If I rent something and like I go into a house and then the heater and the air conditioner or the windows don't work, well, that's not on me. If I rented something, the windows are cracked, the owner has to fix that. But if I messed something up and I broke it, then I have to fix it. So liability, again, that's why I said, ask yourself, what happens if something goes wrong? Why? Because the renter, the one who's renting to you, owns the property. You don't own it yet. So if you don't own it, the liability will be more on them than you. But in the transaction in which I own it, then I am bearing the cost of responsibility and upkeep and wear and tear, and I have more of a liability than the owner. So don't think that just because the transactions look the same but have different names, that's inconsequential. It's quite the opposite. They're very consequential, and the consequence of these differences will always be in the details of the contract. So even though I might have personally some criticism to some of the positions that some of the modern muftis have and whatnot, what I don't disagree with them on is that the names matter very much. As a matter of fact, I think I might have mentioned to you in a previous lecture that some Muslim majority countries have stipulated that the conventional banks stop using the word al-qard, a loan, and start using the word at-tamwil, because the names matter. Because when it comes to fiqh, if we're basing our law on fiqh, or it's inspired by fiqh, or the Sharia of Islam is one of, or the major source of legislation of a particular country, then it's important that the words matter and that everything kind of gels together, and that eventually we have to create our own system that we are comfortable with the words that we are comfortable with the movement of money and responsibility the way we are comfortable with. So even though sometimes it sounds like we're splitting hairs, it is very important. And there's really not that much more I want to say about this topic, because I think that this is a transaction. If we took the last lecture or two, you're going to instinctively understand this transaction. And I guess we'll just put a pin in it there, and we'll say, Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam wa sallallahu ala sayyidina mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Alhamdulillah, we've concluded today's lecture in which we talked about renting leading to ownership. Sometimes in English it's called renting with the option to buy, or leasing with the option to buy, or renting and or leasing with the condition of purchase. In actuality, these are two separate transactions. There's the renting and then there's the ownership. We've talked about before in the previous lectures that we're taking the opinion in the modern Islamic finance world, we're taking the opinion that we can join two micro transactions to make one larger transaction, even though there's a difference of opinion. We also have no problem whatsoever with renting, because that's prima facie from the Quran and Sunnah, and that's very clear. The issue becomes, some people will say, well, how can you stipulate that there's ownership at the end of renting if it's renting? And there's also a difference of opinion of that. Some said, the majority of scholars said you can't do that. Some schools like the Malikis and the Hanbalis and some others said you can. That's the position that we're taking. But just to satisfy the differences of opinion, in the Islamic banking system, sometimes they'll say, okay, you can rent it and then the bank will gift you the deed. Or you can rent it, transaction 1, transaction 2, you buy it for like a nominal fee, like $1. And I kind of gave you the scenario where if you're paying the coupons, the last one might be like minus $1. So if you owe $500 every month, then the last one will be $499, goes to the rent, and then the $1 is for the purchase of the property or something like that. So they will bifurcate, because they're two separate transactions. The point is that you end up owning the property at the end. Now, for that to work, other than it has to comply with the fiqh, The ownership end has to be something that is enforceable. So that's where it has to be stipulated in law, and you as the consumer have to be protected that if the bank or financial institution doesn't give you the property, you have the right to go to the court, and then the judge can enforce the sale because it's part of the conditions that you had. And even though this looks like some of the previous transactions we talked about, I ended by saying that it's important to understand that there are differences because the words matter. A rent is different than buying. Buying in installments is different than buying all outright. All of these things are different, and the way you know the differences is when you ask yourself what happens if there's a dispute and where is the liability if damages occur. That will oftentimes help you understand the differences between these transactions. والحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى اللهم على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم.